In 1994, Australia overtook Cuba to become the largest exporter of raw sugar in the world. The product of the Queensland cane mills earns nearly $2 billion a year for the nation. It's no secret that the sugar industry of the Caribbean was founded on the labor of African slaves. But few Australians have been told how their own sugar industry was created, by the sweat of men and women enticed or kidnapped by force from the islands of the South Pacific. Thousands of them died, and their unmarked graves now lie beneath the cane fields of North Queensland. But in the minds of their descendants, their memories live on.
This is the final boarding call for Air Vanuatu Flight NF22 to Port Vila. Your plane is now ready for boarding.
Joe and Monica Leo are embarking on a journey to recover a small portion of a stolen past.
Okay, Mrs. Leo, enjoy your flight.
Thank you.
Yeah, sir, have a good trip.
Thank you.
100 years ago, Joe Leo's grandfather and Monica's father were transported by white men across this same ocean. Not away from Australia, but towards it, from an island far to the east. They traveled not as passengers, but as cargo in the dark hold of a trader's ship. They were kidnapped from the tiny island of Pentecost, in what is now the Pacific nation of Vanuatu.
Big arrow. I tell you, big arrow, Bob. It's a can.
The last stage of their long journey is the track which takes them and their children to the village of Lagatoa, where Monica's father was born more than a century ago. The villagers of Lagatoa have never set eyes on Monica Leo, but for weeks they've been preparing to welcome her home.
Oh, no tapo mutake. Ale, kita kada ta sapo kulia. Ulipe mambisirai.
Monica's father and both of Joe Leo's grandparents were taken from the same beach on the same raid. To his astonishment, Joe discovers that the events of a single afternoon a century ago are still remembered on the island.
The story, as we got it here in Pentecost, my grandfather and my grandmother and my wife's father was taken from Fully down on the coast on the beach. They were having a big feast and the ship come in, and then they just took them straight off the beach. And my grandfather, apparently he was in his teens. My wife's father was a very little boy, about 8 or 9 year old. And my grandmother, she was very young. She was only about 10 when they take him over to Australia.
My name is Pargosugi. A big ship came into the bay and men in a big boat came ashore. We had never seen such a big ship before. We thought they wanted coconuts and fruit for trade, so we brought them these things. They took us to the big ship saying, "Don't be afraid, you come have a look at ship." But they throw me down bottom of ship with plenty others. I was frightened. I began to cry. My mother and father and relations were left behind. Then they chased boys from other islands, tied them up hand and foot.
The one name where me harem time where me stop grow up. All fala refer long all get a ship sol se me say all boat long steel man. All boat long steel. And no say me save say all white man we talk about activity or list up sing out say blackbirding. And only sing out say blackbirding where one name me talk here you me no save. But also, you misabe talem say one name way been happening hemi Pacific slave trade.
Sugar planters and others. Henry Ross Lewin for years engaged in trade in the South Sea Islands, begs to inform the public of the arrival of the King Oscar. He will be happy to receive orders for the importation of Kanakas. Parties desirous of engaging labourers, please send in their order. Terms, £7 per man.
The first shipment of Pacific Islanders was landed at Red Bank near Brisbane in August 1863. In America, a bloody civil war was being fought over slavery.
Just as in America, African slaves were used to work and establish the cotton plantations in the South, just as in British colonies like Fiji, Indian coolies were brought in, so too in colonial Queensland, we looked to Pacific Island labour to establish the sugar industry. Very few white Australians still understand that the Queensland sugar industry was based effectively upon slave labour.
Marlene Henaway is Joe Leo's younger sister. She's another grandchild of the boy who was plucked off the beach at Pentecost a century ago. Thousands of the descendants of those reluctant pioneers still live in the little North Queensland towns which grew up with the sugar industry. Marlene remembers her grandfather well, the old man she knew as Poppy.
Poppy came from a village in Pentecost, from Pentecost Island. He was only 12 years old at the time, 12, 13-year-old. So you can imagine the traumatic experience that he would have went through. They were brought over here to a northern port, and then they were made to work in the sugar fields. Okay, have a look for a cross. Can you find me a cross? When they first came out here, they were given one set of clothing, and that was it. They had to work side by side clearing paddocks so that the big farmers can get their cane into the ground. So they're basically used as machinery as well, not just coming to cut the cane.
Mi blong epi island. Mino save long wane miaro le kisimi golong makai. Mino save Hamas Christmas migdinigia tasol mi mantunis. Master, he give me 1 plus sarep na mi to. Go cut him sugar long hap. He get 1 plamani save was long mi plan nem blong em overseer. Sampla time this pla overseer get big pla cross long olgata boy. And me fight him now, whip him olgata. Tommy Lamon Makai.
The Pacific Islanders weren't technically slaves. They were paid for their labor. But at about 1/5 the rate the planters would have had to pay white workers. If that is, in a colony where labor was desperately short, they could have found any Europeans willing to sweat it out on the cane fields.
In the 19th century, Europeans were fairly firmly convinced that they weren't capable of labouring hard in the tropics. They thought they would die, as one source said, from premature rack and decay, so that they were firmly convinced that they needed a coloured labour force. And as those plantations developed, Queensland prospered. Queensland could not have developed as quickly as it did in the 19th century without the use of cheap Melanesian labour. There was no other way that it could have been done.
Noah Sabo is a second-generation Australian South Sea Islander. Now 74, he can remember the stories about life on the early plantations told to him by his grandfather, one of the very first islanders transported to Queensland back in 1863.
This is the old Lindaroo plantation, and this is where the Kanakas worked, and when they came here, and this old Lindaroo, they say it had a good few people working here in its heyday, you know. They had to do their work properly, you know. You had to go out and chip cane or cut cane or thrash cane. You had to do it properly. If you didn't do it properly, well, the overseer, he always had a big boot on, and he would, of course, he used to ride a horse too, and it didn't take him many minutes to get off the horse and give them a good taste of his boot, so that all the work was done properly. They couldn't slum up their work, but it was hard on the plantations.
Phyllis Corowa lives comfortably enough today. She's the oldest of 10 children. Their father, Moses Anaris, was kidnapped in the 1890s from Tanna, another tiny island in Vanuatu. Phyllis's maternal grandmother was brought to Bundaberg as a young girl. But whether she was enticed to come or was simply grabbed by force, family tradition no longer tells.
They did bring women out, but not a lot. My mother's mother was brought out from Ober Island, and I think my grandmother was very young. I have seen photos of her chipping cane, like the cane is already grown. Chipping cane with men and an overseer standing in the rows watching them, see that they were doing the work right. My grandmother never liked to talk about it. Now that I'm able to piece all these things together, I feel that she was missing her family life and the island that she had left.
Me come from Oba Island. Nemblomi hem mati telavus. When me come to this country, Mrs. and Master calling me Elizabeth Oba. Me house girl and me clean him house belong Mrs. and Master. Me play with them pikinini belong Master and me sing him island songs from my home. Sometime when I finish housework, Mrs. say, "You now go clear him bush. You now go clear him ground. For Master, me dig him tree and plant him plenty sugar cane."
However hard the life in the cane fields, there was little the islanders could do about it. In the rest of Australia, white workers were organising. Trades unions were being formed. The working class was becoming one of the wealthiest in the world. But on the sugar plantations, Melanesian labourers were forbidden by law to strike for better wages or conditions, or to desert their employment. The penalty for absconding was 3 months' imprisonment. Right from the start, the so-called Queensland labour system was a subject of fierce controversy in Australia.
Kidnapping, slave trade and slavery are ugly words to use.
We have no hesitation in denouncing the trade in human beings.
Do we want a sugar industry in this country or do we not?
Are we to accept slavery in Queensland when our brothers in America have shed their blood to end it?
If the government wants regulation, let them pay for it. One thing's certain, without the nigger, we wouldn't have an industry at all. Mackay Mercury.
There was considerable pressure for total abolition of the Pacific Islander trade that especially came from Melbourne and from Sydney. So you have a situation rather like how the American North denounced the slave-owning South. So here in Australia you have the Australian South denouncing rather contemptuously the slave-owning north of Australia and especially of Queensland.
An act to regulate and control the introduction and treatment of Pacific labourers, March 4, 1868.
Eventually, a reluctant Queensland Parliament was forced by public pressure to make some attempt to control the labour trade. Although dominated by pastoralists and plantation owners, it passed an act in 1868 which required employers to provide Melanesian labourers with food and clothing and a wage of £6 per year. The maximum length of a labour contract was 3 years, and the employer was responsible for paying the islanders' fare home. But even in far-off London, the trade had become notorious. Slavery had been abolished throughout the British Empire back in 1833. To many in Britain, the Queensland system of indentured labour was just slavery by another name. The most scandalous stories to reach British ears came not from the plantations in Queensland, but from the islands. In 1872, the British Parliament passed the Kidnapping Act to try to stop the forcible abduction of islanders by unscrupulous traders. Kidnapping was not entirely stamped out, but after that, most traders relied more on persuasion and less on brute force. Exactly what the islanders were told about Australia, it's impossible to know, but thousands were induced to sign on.
Islanders knew that they could go to Queensland for 3 years, work on a plantation or farm, in that time collect what was to them a substantial amount of European goods, axes, knives, guns, and that's really why they participated so willingly in the last 20 years or so of the labour trade.
Even after a single 3-year contract, the path back to the simple life of the villages was seldom easy. And the longer the islanders stayed in Australia, the wider grew the cultural gulf that separated them from the world they had left. Monica Leo has been estranged from her own people's language and custom by a century of separation.
Tamamwa misal memea mambaba hogosin tamamwa meme mambaba ratahin mua ratahiko ulia omai omhabedumia omai omsilomuleyao inao tamamwa.
Last year we came over to Pentecost Island and hoping to find our relatives then, but you know, we couldn't find anyone, so we sort of made a few contacts and then went back home to Australia and decided to come back again this year to to come and try and find out where our relatives were, and this is why we're here today. We found them and very grateful.
The discovery that their chief had a first cousin living in Queensland, Australia, came as a complete surprise to the villagers of Labatoa. They had never known what had happened to the relatives who disappeared so mysteriously in the Blackbirders' ships. There was even a legend in the village that they'd been taken to a neighbouring island and eaten by their traditional enemies.
Let me help you.
Monica be ramen himameira be lolbila meute be rarumen gitai be kunhanige tamara nu mai wanu tomo loroboga teti maloroboga be votu la maram leia ram le surainia kamai ram do la builoite ramimai be rarumen gita mule ute be tamara nu loroboga ia nuri bilan damu ia nuri bilan manioko ia bilan kumara Hurihan rim leila be lol tanomiu kabro muhantai hina tamara be ram leia ba no kamera mulenga inau seluin liliu nam lenga lol matan molamua.
Joe Leo's grandfather had come from another village higher up the mountainside, but the path to it has been little used for the best part of 90 years. The village was abandoned at the turn of the century. According to old Chief Aru, the Blackbirders' raids were to blame. It's a story that was repeated all over the islands of Vanuatu.
Before Blackbirding, Ololvala has been stopped story about blande place where villages have been stopped long time before. Populations have been big one to mass. But a time when me fella stop grow up, every place here is bush. You know that man. White man, he been make him say population blow you me, ikolosapi wipe out.
By the 1890s, more than 50,000 people from dozens of Pacific islands had been transported to Queensland on 3-year contracts. Most then returned to the islands, but some decided to stay. Segregated from the European settlers, they brought their islander culture to the creeks and gullies on the outskirts of the sugar towns.
Being an agricultural people, these Kanakas, they tried to have the habitat they had over there, they tried to revive it over here, working the soil, planting their gardens, and it doesn't become old with them, you know, it doesn't become old hat with them. Every day they'll be there. The Kanakas, they lived all along here. They caught fish in this creek here and fish out there in the salt pan. And two, they had these big fig trees here. And they had the coconut trees too along here. So it reminded them of where they came from, the habitat. And this is why they like to come here, you know.
But gradually the pull of the islands would weaken. As the decades passed, the songs they sang, the clothes they wore, the very way they thought came more from the world they lived in and less from the world they'd left.
Let's go, short pass, quick pass, come on, toss it around. Okay, come back. Okay, switch it around to the corners now, all in the one move.
I used to take great delight in saying to my friends that I'm the grandson of a cannibal, and I used to play little jokes on them, such telling them my grandfather ate people and the kids used to run and scatter.
Quick ball, Evie. Oh, back you come, Jamie.
Des Egmalesi's grandfather arrived in Bundaberg from Santo Island in 1887. It would be 6 years before he saw his island again.
Turn it over, mate, quick, turn it over. Put it rolling, Jeffrey.
Grandfather Egmalis completed his 3-year term, and for reasons unknown only to himself, he agreed on another 3 years. Then he went back to Santo, all geared up in his hobnail boots and straw hat, felt hat, and fully clothed, as opposed to when he left in a loincloth and nothing else.
Perhaps Grandpa Egmalesi's hobnail boots trod on too many toes on Santo. Within a year or two, he was sailing back to Bundaberg.
After he returned the second time to Bundaberg, he married my grandmother, and they worked together in Bundaberg and then went on to Nambour. My grandfather and my grandmother were never able to go back to the islands after they got married, Eddie, because they'd both come from different islands. And it was frowned upon very much in those days. In fact, it probably led to death marrying somebody from another island.
By the 1890s, the town of Bundaberg had grown rich on the proceeds of the sugar trade. It's still a wealthy town today. From the mills and distilleries on the edge of town, sugar and rum flows out, and the money flows back in. In Bundaberg Cemetery, grandiose memorials to the old planter families stretch in well-kept rows. But no marble angels stand over the graves of the men and women on whose back-breaking toil the sugar trade was founded.
That's enough my work. I'm an office worker, really.
Hard labour and too much of it. Bad food and too little of it. Diseases to which they had no immunity. All these cost thousands of islander lives. The death rate was 4 times the European average. Their bodies were buried out of sight, as their sufferings have been largely out of mind.
Okay, where we are now, and where the boys are working behind me, is what we still call, and what they called in the early days, the Kanaka Cemetery, which was also known as the Heathen Cemetery, which is probably 200 yards away from the cemetery that Europeans used, and there's approximately 400 buried here. Some of these sugar plantations, some of these farms, there are Kanaka graves unmarked. They were buried where they died in the paddock. At least this here is, it might have been regarded as a Kanaka cemetery or a heathen cemetery, but at least they're here. As opposed to where they were up in the bush and everywhere and all around, the higgledy-piggledy around the place. So with the help of these all my nephews and cousins and relations here that are doing a tremendous job, this here will eventually be restored into something to what we would like it, to what they deserve in the 90s. What should have been done in the 100 years ago, in their 80s, you know.
Where the supervisors?
Kenny, reckon this is the same spot you sat last time?
Yeah, it is.
Now to get up and do some work.
We're women, we're not men.
Hey, don't you bring me back Thursday? Gee. Even though we make a joke when we're working, it's sad, really. But it's an old saying that we got between us. We laugh to stop ourselves from crying. And that's true. Well.
Most of the islanders who chose to stay in Australia made efforts to assimilate to their new land. They became ardent Christian converts. They adopted European manners and no longer spoke their native tongues. But as the turn of the century approached, the Kanakas became not more but even less acceptable to most white Australians. The depression of the 1890s had brought widespread unemployment, which fanned the smouldering racism of the working class.
This cancer of alien-coloured labour has been allowed to eat into our country for far too long already.
A naturally weak constitution. This is the Kanaka's great secret.
And no white woman is safe alone in a Kanaka
He doesn't
district.
die altogether.
But
He
these
remains
brutes can
half
never be
dead and
trusted.
quite submissive. He is priceless to the planter because he's preeminently kickable. The Bulletin, 1892.
From the early 1890s, it was the white labour movement that took up the cudgels most energetically in terms of the abolition of the Pacific Islander labour trade. The opposition was primarily economic, fearing that workers' wages would be undercut, but also was part of a much wider image of Australia and the labouring classes as this being a land for white men, unfortunately, but this being a land for white people. And I suppose this is best exemplified in the labour press, in magazines like The Worker and The Boomerang, so that Melanesians were portrayed as savages, untamable savages, especially sexually. So the threat that the Pacific Islander labourers posed to European women was dwelt upon. The Kanaka was portrayed as taking away not just wealth, but white women as well.
Mr. Speaker, I have been strongly affected by the ideal of a white Australia and by the hope of being able to keep away from our shores forever.
In the jubilant atmosphere of federation, the call for a white Australia swept through all the former colonies. One of the first pieces of legislation passed by the new federal parliament in 1901 was the Immigration Restriction Act, which effectively banned all non-white immigration. In the same year, Parliament was presented with a bill to put a stop to the Queensland labour trade. The sugar planters fought a stubborn rearguard action.
Responsible men in Queensland are talking seriously of resorting to civil war.
The miserable pittance, and who are dealt with very much in the same way as slaves.
The death of the sugar industry and will create a bitter feeling against federation and
the planters lost, and the act was passed. No Melanesian labourer could be recruited after 1904. And 2 years later, the Act laid down Pacific Islanders already in Australia were to be forcibly deported.
I come to Queensland long time ago. I have wife and plenty children here. We are good Christian people. Kanaka like me build white fellow sugar business. Now white man no more wants black man. He's used him up altogether and chasing him away. He say to Kanaka, clear out, this country belong a white man. These boys now come here by own free will. Ship come to their island, make fools of them and fetch them here. And now when they find Jesus and get civilized, they are deported. Jektana, North Queensland.
The islanders themselves fought to remain in Queensland, and they came together in a political organisation and fought back quite successfully with petitions and with deputations to say that they had a right to stay in Australia. It was outrageous to deport these people who had become Christian, settled Queenslanders with families, and to send them back to their own islands could mean their deaths.
The cries of protest from the cane fields were eventually heard in Brisbane. 6 months before the deportation was due to take place, the Queensland government appointed a royal commission. On its recommendation, the federal government agreed that old people, islanders married to Aborigines or Europeans, and those who'd been living in Queensland for more than 20 years could stay. All the others, around 4,000, would have to leave.
There are families in Australia today that were split apart. Some brothers and sisters perhaps went back with father to the islands. Some children remained with mother in Australia. The scenes on the wharves were traumatic, full of anguish. Children, brothers and sisters, never saw the other sides of their families again once they sailed off on the boats.
But Joe Leo's grandfather never came back to Pentecost. By the time of deportation, he was married and settled in Bundaberg and was allowed to stay. Monica's father was another of the few who managed to remain in Australia. Until her unexpected return, the people of Lagatoa had heard nothing about her father and had gradually forgotten all about him. Noah Sabo's grandparents had been in Queensland for over 20 years. They were one of only 27 families in Mackay exempted from the deportation order. Des Egmalesi's granddad Negus was another who was allowed to stay, though they did try to deport his brother. But great-uncle Tom jumped ship, swam back to shore, and successfully went into hiding. Phyllis Corowa's father managed to escape by walking south.
My father didn't want to go back then to the islands, and he ran away to Sydney. And he walked, took him many, many days to walk to Sydney along the beach. A white lady had a boarding house in Sydney. She used to take in all the islanders, and she hid him. And he said all he was doing was staying in the kitchen and washing up. He did say that he stayed many months in Sydney, and then he got enough money to come back up here to Queensland again. He really wanted to work here in Australia. He said you could make plenty of money here, but it didn't happen that way.
The sweetest story ever told. Here is the Australian version of it. I wonder if you knew that Australia is the only country in the world where cane sugar is produced and manufactured by white labour under white man's conditions and rates of pay. Splendid specimens these, typical sun-tanned Australian manhood at its best, and the cane they cut is taller than themselves. North Queensland has shown that the white man can thrive on hard work in the tropics. The Australian sugar industry...
After deportation, the Australian Workers' Union launched a crusade to turn the sugar industry into a whites-only preserve. Farmers who used only European labour received a bounty from the federal government. And in 1919, as soldiers returned from the Great War looking for work, Melanesians were excluded by law from working on European farms.
Some of the farmers were lenient towards a lot of the islanders because they were good workers, and they used to give them work of a night time. They used to go out and chip cane of a night time and cut the cane of a night time. My grandmother used to say that she used to go out night time and chip cane. That was a way that they could work illegally to survive, really.
Less than 2,000 islanders had managed to avoid being deported. But ironically, to stay in Australia, most had to return to an island way of life.
After being abandoned from the cane industry, my grandparents settled in a little settlement of Joscalee. They survived on growing gardens and living out of the sea, fish and crabs and prawns and from the bush. And so Grandma and Granddad just grew their family up in just a simple house with dirt floor, hessian bags for walls. And I think the input that they put into their children was mostly to value families, not material things. And this is basically what I think our old South Sea Island people put into each and every one of us as their descendants, that the value of family is much more precious than the value of money.
10 points to 0. This is just a great bit of play down
We, as kids, used to go out to the camps where all the old single South Sea Islanders used to live, and they were all the same. They used to talk in broken English to us and talk to us, and give us money. It's the part we liked anyway. And I can recall, like as if it was now, their little gardens. They'd have their little picket fence gardens, and they made gardens out of nothing. And they lived in little groups here and there everywhere. Grandfather Nags was quite adamant. He used to say, no, you're here in Australia now. You don't want to know anything about the islands. You're never going to go back there and live. And you learn the Australian way.
Events in Europe prove that every man is needed. So here they come, answering the call. Men from every walk of life.
And then once more the wheel turned, and Australia needed the islanders again. As thousands of Australians joined up to fight Hitler, the sugar farms lost their white field hands, and the Melanesians were called back to cut the cane. That was when Noah Sabo learned the skills of the cane cutter from men 30 years older than himself.
All our old men, our uncles and that, they went back cutting cane. See, they knew how to cut it. And I tell you, they could work. And I remember going out with them. They said, oh, boy, you come tomorrow, we cut the cane. Oh, yeah. And I thought, well, I'll give it to these old fellas. But I tell you, at the end of the day, they had to nearly carry me home.
And now, in the 1990s, the tiny nucleus which avoided deportation has grown into a community some 20,000 strong. Through decades of poverty and exclusion, islanders have married islanders. Their close-knit families a shield against the outside world.
Smile, everybody.
Okay.
Jason Smith is trying to. Kenny Naylor overtime. A master stroke from Tim.
Gradually, in recent years, the barriers have been coming down. In sport especially, islanders, like Aboriginal people, have found a path to success and recognition. Kenny Nagus of the Canberra Raiders is Des Egmalesi's nephew. And his former captain Mal Meninga is one of their own as well. But how many football fans would know who the South Sea Islanders are, or how they came to Australia?
The fairy tale comes true.
When I met Desi, I didn't even realise there was a different race to Aboriginals. I couldn't recognise them as different.
And that's the case of a lot of people.
And I think that's very common. As I became more involved with the family, I was really amazed. Originally, I'm talking about 25 years ago, they would still talk about white people being nice to them, and that white person treated me just like I was a white person. Of course, this just absolutely horrified me.
One way or another, the descendants of those Pacific Island sugar workers have found a place for themselves in Australia. Their families have been in Queensland for longer than all but a handful of Queenslanders. But gaining acceptance has never been easy.
Pardon?
That's a good one again.
Too heavy. It is strange how people come up often and say to me, do you like living out here? And I say, well, I should do. I was born right here. And I tell them I'm an Australian born, and they look at me wide-eyed. And I said, and you want to know where my parents come from? They come from Vanuatu. Both Les and I...
In 1994, the Australian government formally recognised the Pacific Islanders as a distinct ethnic community, the only substantial black migrant group in Australia.
One each way now, one each way.
But Des Egmales, for one, still isn't satisfied that justice has been done to his people.
Well, a lot of people have asked me, you know, what am I missing out on in the world today? Well, I'm not missing out on bugger all, really. But what I want
is the recognition for my people for the work in which they did early in establishing the cane industry, the recognition for their blood, sweat and tears.
I'm proud to be called a Kanaka, and I'm proud to be a direct descendant of the old people who were brought out here. We believe is slavery. I believe is slavery, for the want of better wording. I'm proud to be called a Kanaka. I always will be.
Another couple of burnt snags or half-burnt snags or right off.
The Kanaka's sweated labour laid one of the foundations for Australia's prosperity, which at last Australian islanders are just beginning to share. But like most people in this nation of immigrants, the islanders are finding that to be confident of who they are, they need to understand where they came from. More and more of them these days are making the journey to find out. For the Leo family, the visit to Pentecost was more overwhelming than they'd expected. They rediscovered their roots in an island culture thousands of years old. But they had to come to terms with the fact that though they could attempt to understand it, they could no longer possibly belong.
When you say to come over here and live, it's a hard decision because I got my home back in Australia.
One week later, in the land which his grandfather had helped to clear with nothing but muscle power and machetes, Joe Leo was back at work. He and Monica are still trying to come to terms with what they found out on Pentecost, about their origins, their island culture, the history of their families, and about themselves.
Them ships there now, they symbolise taking away in the boats in the Blackbirding days. That's what those, and that's what that dance is all about. Yeah, well, one of the main things I think in our lives that I found out for the first time this year was Monica's father, Charlie Malamud, was related to my grandfather.
We really found out that we were supposed to be cousins. Very distant cousins, I hope. Known each other all our lives, I didn't even know we were related.
But it's a sad thing, eh? You know, when you don't really know what you are, eh? Or who you are, eh? And that's what it's all boiled down to. You know, when you say we're trying to dig up our past, trying to find out where we come from, and you're getting all these other things out of coming out the woodwork that you didn't realise. Yeah.
Maybe had we known this, we may not have got married.
I cut there.